April 29th, 1945. Dachau, Germany. In the midst of American troops liberating the camp, chaos erupted. Prisoners hunted their Nazi guards. They smashed fists into faces, drove shovels into skulls, stomped on bodies. They dragged some to the wall and shot them, beat others until they begged for mercy. Years of torment and starvation exploded into savage vengeance. Blood flowed across the yard. Fury ruled every strike. But how could liberation turn into this? Why did the powerless strike with such ruthless force? And in the next few minutes, you'll see the hidden story history tried to erase. The liberation of the camps. When hell broke loose. About 16 kilometers northwest of Munich, U.S. 7th Army soldiers advanced in the liberation of Dachau. They expected survivors, hidden guards, maybe evidence of cruelty, but nothing prepared them for what they would uncover. At first, the camp looked like any other prisoner facility. Low barracks, barbed wire, watchtowers. The soldiers moved cautiously, rifles ready, eyes scanning for hidden dangers. Then they reached the rail siding. Boxcars sat abandoned, doors slightly ajar. Inside, a scene unfolded that froze them mid-step. Nearly 2,000 corpses, some decomposing, others freshly dead, tangled together. The stench hit first. Soldiers gagged, swore, some turned away. Private letters later described the scene as a train of death that no one should ever see. Inside the camp, survivors appeared. Frail figures in striped rags, many weighing less than 80 pounds. Some stumbled, others collapsed mid-step, their bodies barely holding on. Broken shouts of thanks rose in German, Yiddish, and English, cutting through the stench and chaos. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks and his men moved quickly, guiding the living away from the dead and trying to restore order. Shortly after, a Swiss Red Cross delegate arrived, flanked by 2 SS officers carrying a white flag. As the surrender was announced, the survivors barely registered it. Years of starvation, abuse, and fear had left them raw and tense. Amid the chaos of freed prisoners stumbling through the camp, a quiet, simmering rage began to surface. Each step past a guard, each memory of cruelty, fed it. In the crowded yards and broken barracks, that anger spread, coiling tightly, ready to explode. The first flickers of revenge were stirring, waiting for the moment to strike. The Dachau Wall, where the firing began. In the coal yard, where coal for the camp's boilers was stored and shoveled daily, chaos erupted. No one knew exactly what sparked it. Some prisoners said they saw a guard smirk at their suffering. Others whispered it began when starving inmates discovered hidden weapons. Fear and rage collided in an instant. Around 50 SS men were corralled near the yard. Prisoners, emaciated and trembling from years of abuse, surged forward. Shovels, clubs, and fists rained down. Faces smashed, ribs cracked, blood splattered across the cobblestones. Some guards begged for mercy, but years of cruelty left prisoners merciless. A few American soldiers, stunned and unsure, either looked away or handed rifles to the inmates. One machine gun fired briefly, cutting down a handful of SS, before Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, commanding the 157th Infantry Regiment, returned and kicked the weapon aside. Sparks tried to restore order, shouting at both prisoners and soldiers, but the fury had its own momentum. By the end, 30 to 50 SS men lay dead, some beaten beyond recognition. The hunt didn't end there. Guards hiding in freight cars or attempting to blend with prisoners were dragged out. Those in striped disguises were unmasked, their crimes recited aloud, punishment exacted. Kapos, the prisoner functionaries who had enforced punishments, were singled out, tied, beaten, and some strangled with ropes. Survivors struck back for every scar, every torture session, every lost friend. American officers moved carefully through the camp, trying to contain the chaos that still simmered in the yards and barracks. Sparks ordered perimeter patrols to prevent prisoners from hunting down more guards, separated SS men from the crowd, and guided emaciated survivors back toward the hospital area for care. Soldiers tallied casualties and tried to calm the wounded, while camp records, weapons, and evidence of brutality were secured. Detailed reports were filed documenting the killings and the circumstances that had led to them, noting clear violations of the Geneva Convention. When the reports reached General George S. Patton, military governor of Bavaria, he studied the files but decided no prosecutions would follow. Patton acknowledged that the killings were unlawful, yet he argued it was impossible to judge men who had just witnessed the depths of Dachau's horrors, the smoke of the crematorium still in their minds, the emaciated bodies scattered across the yards, the survivors' rage palpable and raw. In his view, the fury of the prisoners, the collapse of authority, and the storm of revenge could only be understood in the context of the camp's extremes. But Dachau was only the first. Days later, another camp erupted, and this time, it was prisoners themselves who seized power. Buchenwald, the forest of fear, unleashed. Buchenwald, perched on the forested hills just outside Weimar, sprawled across more than a dozen square kilometers. Stone barracks, brick workshops, and the ominous tower of the main guard post stretched as far as the eye could see, all encircled by barbed wire and electrified fences. Unlike Dachau, there was no train of corpses disgorging at the gates, no shock to freeze liberators in disbelief. The horror of Buchenwald had seeped into every brick, every shadow, every scar etched on the prisoners' faces. Here, suffering had been quieter, insidious, and omnipresent. When the Americans arrived on April 11, 1945, more than 20,000 emaciated survivors emerged from the barracks and labor yards. Their skin hung loose over bones, their eyes hollowed by hunger and grief. Years of forced labor in stone quarries, endless roll calls, and cruel medical experiments, some overseen by SS Dr. Karl Gebhardt, had left them fragile but simmering with a suppressed anger. Many could barely stand, yet a fire of revenge coursed through them, fed by months of secret preparation. For over a year, a clandestine prisoner committee had been quietly organizing. Communists, socialists, and others, men like Louis Michels, a German Jewish survivor and former physician, and Ernst Busch, a committed socialist, kept careful lists of the SS personnel, capos, and clerks whose cruelty had marked every day with fear and death. They had memorized faces, routines, and crimes, whispering in code to avoid detection. When the guards abandoned the camp in the face of the advancing American troops, the prisoners moved. At first, it was small groups acting quietly, dragging capos from the barracks where they had ruled with whips and fists. Some capos were forced to kneel in the camp courtyards as survivors recited the details of their brutality: beatings, executions, betrayals. A few, like the notorious SS man Wilhelm Frick, who had overseen prisoner labor details, were met with immediate, violent reckoning. SS clerks and mid-level officers fared no better. Survivors had long kept records, sometimes etched into scraps of paper or memorized by heart. One clerk, involved in compiling lists for medical experiments and labor deportations, was seized and confronted by those whose families had been destroyed. Witnesses later recounted that prisoners would speak aloud the names of each victim, their deaths recited almost like a litany before punishment was delivered, a grim justification for the fury that followed. When the first American units reached Buchenwald, some officers attempted to intervene, separating the surviving SS from the prisoners. Others, perhaps seeing the inevitability, turned their eyes away, silently allowing justice to unfold. Unlike the chaotic eruptions at Dachau, Buchenwald's retribution was partially organized. The prisoner councils had prearranged orders: who would be confronted first, Who would receive the harshest punishment? How to mete out justice without descending into indiscriminate slaughter? Anger became deliberate, guided, yet still raw and brutal. By the time the camp was fully secured, dozens of capos and SS officials had been executed on the spot. Scores more were beaten, humiliated, or left incapacitated. And the echoes of Buchenwald's revenge did not remain contained, as another revenge echoes across other camps. Bergen-Belsen, from starvation to fury. Just a few days after the Buchenwald incident, on April 15, 1945, British troops of the 11th Armored Division rolled into Bergen-Belsen, near Celle, Germany. The scene was staggering. Around 60,000 survivors huddled among 10,000 unburied corpses in the open courtyards and between the makeshift wooden barracks. Typhus, rampant and unchecked, claimed new victims daily, while starvation had hollowed faces into masks of disbelief and despair. Soldiers later wrote in diaries that the air was so thick with the stench of decay it choked us, and many vomited the moment they entered the camp. Dead bodies were stacked in corners, some still clothed, others stripped bare. Rats scurried over the piles, feeding alongside the living. Chaos erupted almost immediately. SS guards left behind, some pretending to be sick, others begging for mercy, became the immediate target of survivor rage. In the infamous Hunger Courtyard, emaciated prisoners armed themselves with sticks, stones, broken bed frames, and fragments of barbed wire fencing. They hunted down the men who had brutalized them, forced them into work until collapse, or tortured family and friends. Names were shouted as blows landed. A former inmate, Ernst Grube, recalled seeing an SS overseer, Karl Schöngarth, dragged into a heap of corpses and beaten with scrap wood and metal poles. Another, Ludwig Engels, described a guard pinned to the ground, while survivors smashed his knees and ribs, chanting the names of those he had murdered. Some attacks were orchestrated with a grim, unofficial precision. In the northern barracks near Block 12, groups of prisoners cornered known capos and SS men, striking in synchronized bursts to prevent escape. Other survivors acted alone, driven by years of abuse and the sudden shock of liberation. One woman, Herta Hafner, who had lost her entire family, smashed a guard's face with a brick she had hidden under her thin blanket for days, finally releasing the terror and grief she had carried silently. British soldiers tried to intervene, sometimes allowing the fury to unfold as a form of raw justice, other times forcibly pulling prisoners away before the violence escalated further. Every scar, every punishment block, every forced march contributed to the intensity of the attacks. It was deeply personal, revenge interwoven with survival. In the shadows of Dachau, Buchenwald, and Bergen-Belsen, vengeance became as tangible as food or water. It was messy, brutal, and unstoppable. Liberated prisoners were no longer merely survivors. They had become instruments of their own justice, forged by starvation, relentless cruelty, and years of witnessing the powerful crush the weak. Ohrdruf, echoes of horror in the hills. On April 4, 1945, the 4th Armored Division of the U.S. Third Army, advancing through Thuringia, became the first American unit to reach Ohrdruf, a Buchenwald subcamp. The scene that greeted them shocked even the hardened soldiers. Over 10,000 dead and dying lay among the barracks, workshops, and storage basements. In many rooms, corpses had been hastily stacked for cremation, some still showing the signs of life that had vanished too late. The smell of rot and human waste was overpowering, and the living prisoners, skeletons draped in rags, faces sunken and eyes wide with disbelief, collapsed as troops moved through the camp. Sergeant Robert A. Wilson, one of the first Americans to enter, recalled in his journal, "It was as if the world had stopped. Bodies like firewood, piled and forgotten, and the survivors looking at us as though salvation had come too late." Chaos followed almost immediately. Survivors, having been confined to grueling labor and constant abuse, seized the sudden absence of full SS oversight. Groups of prisoners, particularly former political detainees and Jewish inmates, confronted the remaining guards and capos who had overseen forced labor, torture, and executions. In the open yard near Block 7, witnesses recalled guards stripped to their shirts, forced to kneel on muddy ground while prisoners struck them with wooden beams, metal rods, and stones. One survivor, Joseph Schleimer, remembered shouting the names of friends who had been beaten to death while driving the strikes. "Every blow was for them. Every scream a reckoning we had waited for years to deliver." Some guards were executed on the spot. Heinz Rosenberg, another survivor, described seeing a notorious capo, previously responsible for overseeing the sandpit labor detail, where dozens had perished from exhaustion, shot after being dragged into the central courtyard. Others were humiliated, forced to wash prisoners' feet, scrub floors with bare hands, or carry corpses to the basements where hasty cremations had begun. U.S. soldiers attempted to intervene in some cases, pulling guards away from immediate harm, but often the sheer size of the camp and the emotional chaos prevented full control. What occurred in those hours was raw, unmediated retribution, short-lived, yet intensely personal. Prisoners targeted men they remembered from beatings, executions, and forced labor, acting as judge, jury, and executioner in the brief moments of liberation. Even after U.S. forces secured the camp, the impact lingered. Ohrdruf became a symbol of what sudden freedom could unleash when human fury met the absence of authority. Prisoner revenge did not only occur in Germany. In Poland, a later report noted, the fury of liberation ignited again, with deadly consequences for the remaining guards, as prisoners in camps from Auschwitz to Stutthof seized the moment to strike back at their oppressors. Maidanek, the day the prisoners struck back. The night of July 22, 23, 1944, the Soviet First Ukrainian Front, commanded by Marshal Ivan Konev, reached Maidanek, a concentration and extermination camp sprawling across 230 acres just east of Lublin, Poland. The camp had been built in 1941 and expanded over the next 3 years, with 4 gas chambers, 6 crematoria, and brick barracks that housed thousands. When Soviet troops entered, they found the camp in terrifying order. Gas chambers still sealed, ovens blackened with ash, and warehouses stuffed with human belongings. In one storage building alone, soldiers counted over 10 dozen pairs of shoes, piles of human hair stacked in sacks, hundreds of eyeglasses, and dozens of prosthetic limbs. In the barracks and hidden cellars, roughly 500 survivors huddled together, emaciated men, women, and children who had survived starvation, disease, and brutal forced labor. One survivor, 22-year-old Jakub Goldwasser, later recalled staggering out of Barrack 22 and seeing the SS guards flee in panic, their eyes wide with fear. Within hours, Maidanek erupted. Prisoners, many of whom had been forced to work in the crematoria or as kitchen staff, seized the remaining 60 SS men. Eyewitness accounts describe how survivors dragged Karl Otto Koch's deputy, Franz Reichmann, into the camp yard. Using wooden beams, rags, and metal rods, the prisoners beat him in front of the barracks where he had executed hundreds. Another guard, Hermann Volkenrath, who had overseen the selection process for gas chambers, was cornered near the warehouses storing personal belongings. Prisoners smashed his rifle across his back and forced him to kneel amid the piles of victims' shoes. Some survivors, including members of the Jewish prisoner underground, set fire to the administrative offices in Block 25, destroying records that had catalogued thousands of deportees. Outside the barracks, chaos spread. Near the gate at the eastern wall, survivors ambushed SS officers attempting to escape toward Lublin. Reports indicate at least 12 guards were killed on the spot, including men who had previously beaten inmates with truncheons or overseen executions. In one chilling moment, a small group of women cornered an officer near the old laundry building, dousing him with water from buckets before striking him with iron rods, the same tools he had used to punish them. The Soviet soldiers had to cordon off sections of the camp to prevent further killings, but by then, the acts of revenge had left a permanent mark on Majdanek. The fury at Majdanek was not random. It was deeply personal. Survivors confronted those who had terrorized them for years, guards they remembered from selections, from forced labor in the quarries, and from the crematoria. Every building, yard, and gate became a stage for acts of immediate justice. For those 500 survivors, the liberation was not only survival, it was a brief reclaiming of power in a place designed to strip them of everything. The survivors' wrath at Majdanek left the camp scarred, a fleeting moment of justice carved from years of suffering, and even Austria would later feel the echo of that liberation fury. Mauthausen, quarry retribution, and bloodied justice. By May 5, 1945, Allied forces were closing in on Austria, and Mauthausen, perched on the rocky hills near Linz, was on the brink of collapse. The camp had been built in 1938 and expanded rapidly, with a network of quarries, barracks, and execution sites that stretched across the granite hills above the Danube. Prisoners, many of them political dissidents, Jews, Romani, and Poles, were forced to haul massive blocks of granite up the infamous Stairs of Death, a 186-step incline from the quarry to the upper terraces. Thousands perished here, crushed, beaten, or executed for failing to meet impossible labor quotas. By the time American troops of the 11th Armored Division arrived, roughly 1,500 emaciated survivors remained, their bodies wasted and minds scarred from years of abuse, starvation, and terror. As the SS guards realized the Allies were near, panic swept through the camp. Some tried to flee. Others attempted to hide evidence of atrocities. But many prisoners, long stripped of power and autonomy, saw a chance for immediate reckoning. Eyewitness testimonies collected after the war describe groups of survivors hunting down the remaining guards. One of the notorious officers, SS Untersturmführer Franz Ziereis, camp commandant until his death on May 23, 1945, had already fled toward Linz. But others, guards like Karl Mann and Hermann Braun, were cornered inside the quarries and barracks. Prisoners dragged them into the main courtyard near Barrack 18, pounding them with wooden beams, metal rods, and the very tools once used to enforce the camp's brutal labor regime. A survivor, 28-year-old Czech prisoner Jan Novak, later recalled how he and others forced guards to climb the quarry steps, only to be struck with ropes and pickaxes until they collapsed. Another, a Polish inmate named Władysław Kowalski, described tying guards to the granite blocks they had once forced prisoners to move, leaving them for hours in the sun as the prisoners vented years of pent-up rage. In some cases, survivors improvised execution-like punishments, smearing guards with mud, forcing them to crawl on their hands and knees, or beating them until they were incapacitated. Accounts suggest at least 8 guards were killed by prisoners in these first chaotic hours, with dozens more severely injured. The revenge was not random. It was precise, often targeting those known for particular cruelty. Guards responsible for selections in the barracks, overseers of quarry punishments, or executioners in the hanging pits were singled out. Survivors moved methodically, striking near the main gate, the laundry, and the kitchens, areas where the worst abuses had taken place. Courtyards became stages for both fury and theatrical justice, with former victims forcing perpetrators to witness the suffering they had inflicted. By May 6th, American troops had fully secured Mauthausen, restoring order and preventing further killings. Yet the damage was done. Stories of prisoner vengeance spread quickly, marking Mauthausen not only as a site of Nazi terror, but as a place where the powerless had, for a brief moment, reclaimed agency. Across Austria, liberation sparked similar acts of personal justice. Lines between reprisal, vengeance, and survival blurred, leaving a complex legacy that would only later intersect with official investigations, the Nuremberg trials, and the historical silence surrounding these episodes. Authorized vengeance, when commanders looked away. The liberation of camps like Maidan, Auschwitz, and Mauthausen revealed a brutal reality. Prisoners exacted vengeance on guards, often with lethal consequences. While these acts were raw, immediate, and personal, they technically violated the principles enshrined in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the earlier 1907 Hague Conventions, which prohibited extrajudicial killings and abuse of detainees. Article 3 of the Universal Declaration declares that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. Yet in the chaos of liberation, these rights were neither protected for the guards nor strictly enforced for the liberated. Historical records show that Allied forces were often aware of these retaliations, but largely chose not to intervene aggressively. In Maidan, Soviet soldiers reportedly secured the perimeter, but allowed survivors to confront or assault the remaining SS guards. Eyewitness accounts describe survivors dragging officers like Hermann Volkenrath and Franz Reichmann into courtyards, striking them with metal rods and wooden beams, acts that would ordinarily constitute murder or grievous assault under international law. One former prisoner, Jakub Goldwasser, later testified that, "We did what the law could not. We struck those who had killed our families, burned our homes, and tried to erase our lives." Media coverage at the time was uneven. Western newspapers like the New York Times and The Guardian reported liberations and atrocities, but often glossed over prisoner-led revenge. A 1945 New York Times article on Maidan noted that some survivors, in their first moments of freedom, attacked camp personnel. But the piece quickly shifted to the broader military advance and the systematic horrors of the camp. The framing suggested a combination of understandable human emotion and a need to maintain the narrative of disciplined liberation. Legal authorities similarly faced dilemmas. The Nuremberg trials prosecuted 22 major Nazi leaders and a number of camp officials, but acts of revenge by liberated prisoners were largely excluded from consideration. The United Nations War Crimes Commission, established in 1943, documented atrocities committed by Axis powers, but made no effort to hold survivors accountable. In part, this reflected pragmatic decisions. The Allies prioritized prosecuting systematic crimes over spontaneous acts of retaliation, especially when witnesses, evidence, and public sympathy aligned with the victims. These omissions highlight a tension in human rights enforcement. The law often assumes a neutral, orderly context, but liberation zones were chaotic, emotional, and morally complex. The Geneva Conventions and later human rights frameworks would codify protections for all detainees. Yet Maidan and Mauthausen illustrate that in practice, law can be suspended by human need for justice. As historian Richard Evans notes, liberation was justice without judges, and the line between vengeance and righteousness was blurred beyond recognition. Justice without boundaries, the day Allies joined the bloodshed. When the camps fell in 1944 and 1945, vengeance was not confined to the liberated prisoners alone. In several cases, Allied soldiers themselves joined in the retribution, blurring the line between liberation and bloodshed. The Soviet Red Army, in particular, allowed and at times actively participated in violent reprisals against captured SS personnel. Their actions reflected both a deep hatred for the Nazi regime and a cultural understanding of justice shaped by years of German atrocities on Soviet soil. At Majdanek in July 1944, Soviet soldiers of the First Ukrainian Front under Marshal Ivan Konev entered a camp where thousands of Jews, Poles, and Soviet POWs had perished. Reports indicate that several captured SS guards were handed over directly to survivors. Others were beaten by Red Army troops themselves. Soviet war correspondent Konstantin Simonov, who toured the camp in late July, described the atmosphere as a place where hatred lived in every stone, noting that even hardened soldiers struck at guards without hesitation when survivors identified them as torturers. The pattern repeated months later. At Auschwitz, liberated on January 27, 1945, Soviet soldiers of the 60th Army reportedly shot several SS guards in the days immediately following the takeover. Though official Soviet communiques emphasized order and discipline, diaries and later testimonies hint at less controlled moments. A Polish survivor, Tadeusz Borowski, wrote that the soldiers did not stop us, and some even took part, pointing out those in uniforms and delivering the first blows themselves. American and British troops, while officially discouraged from summary executions, also became caught up in the fury. When Dachau was liberated on April 29, 1945, soldiers of the U.S. 45th Infantry Division lined up dozens of captured SS guards against a wall and opened fire, killing an estimated 30 to 50 men. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks later admitted in his testimony that he personally intervened to stop the shootings, but only after dozens had already fallen. Survivor accounts suggest that freed prisoners cheered and, in some cases, joined in beating captured guards with rifle butts and bare fists. The Soviets, however, were the most consistent in permitting vengeance. Historian Catherine Meridale records that Red Army commanders often justified reprisals as legitimate war justice. One Soviet officer in Lublin reportedly told his men on July 24, 1944, "Do not restrain the people. Let the murderers feel what they have sown." The thin line between justice and revenge. The morality of these actions has been the subject of intense debate among historians and ethicists. On one hand, the context was extraordinary. Systematic murder, starvation, and torture had been inflicted on millions. As legal scholar Oren Gross notes, the liberators faced a moral paradox: how to enforce justice when conventional law was powerless, and the victims themselves demanded immediate accountability. The camps were not courts. They were sites of trauma and rage, where the normal rules of engagement collapsed under the weight of human suffering. Yet even in this context, questions linger. Historian Richard Rhodes argues that participation by Allied soldiers in extrajudicial killings blurred the boundary between justice and revenge, raising uncomfortable questions about moral authority and restraint. Research into Soviet military archives shows that commanders often tolerated and sometimes encouraged reprisals, framing them as both deterrent and justice. In the Western press, reactions were mixed. Some outlets described the killings as an understandable response to horror, while others expressed unease at the apparent breakdown of discipline and law. Ethically, these events challenge conventional definitions of justice. Were the Red Army soldiers and liberated prisoners administering rightful vengeance, or were they committing acts that law and morality would otherwise forbid? As philosopher Michael Walzer observes, extreme evil provokes extreme response. The question is whether such responses can ever be morally contained. In the chaotic aftermath of liberation, moral lines were often shattered. The question isn't just who struck back, it's whether justice can ever survive when law, outrage, and human vengeance collide. For a few days in 1945, survivors turned the camps upside down. Guards became the hunted, and vengeance replaced law. In the chaos of liberation, prisoners and even some Allied soldiers delivered immediate justice, striking those who had caused years of suffering. Yet this raw reckoning was only temporary. While some guards were killed instantly, others escaped justice for decades. To see how they built new lives after the war, click here.